All right, so y'all go ahead and do the factoring and the math knowledge question for today. Pause the video, and then once everyone is finished, you can unpause the video, and I'll go over the correct answers. So for the factoring, you should have x plus 4 times x plus 8. For the math knowledge question, it says what is in the canister compared to what he needs for the recipe. So the canister has 1 1/4, which you can write as 5/4, and he needs 2 1/2, which you can write as 5/2. And so the amount in the canister is 5/4 over the amount the recipe calls for is 5/2. So whenever we're doing 5/4 divided by 5/2, you change that into multiplying by the reciprocal. So that's going to become 2 over 5. And then these 5s will cancel, and we're left with 2 over 4, which is equal to 1/2. So he has half of the amount of pecans that he needs. So we're looking at lesson 25 today. We're going to be looking at triangle congruence, SSS. So this is the first triangle congruence that we are going to look at. There are several of them we'll look at over the next couple of weeks. So we're going to start off with corresponding sides and corresponding angles. Those are in the same position, but in two different polygons. So if I have two triangles, this angle here is corresponding to this angle. This side is corresponding to this side. Even if I take this one and I turn it, this angle is still corresponding to this one, and this side is still corresponding to this side. Whenever you are naming congruent polygons, you have to make sure that when you order the points, your vertices, that the names are corresponding. So if I started with one angle, and then I went to another one, and then I went to the third one, those three, when I name the other one, the angles have to be corresponding. So let's look here. We want to identify the corresponding angles and sides for the triangle below. So we'll start with the angles. Angle A is corresponding to angle D. And so you can write a little arrow for corresponding. So angle A corresponds to angle D. Angle E over here corresponds to angle C. And then angle B corresponds to angle B. So that would be how the angles correspond. Now for the sides. This side length here, AB, corresponds to this side length here. Now you have to make sure that you order them in the correct way. A corresponded to angle D, so D has to come first, and then B, because A and D correspond and B correspond. For this side length, I'll name it side length EB, and it corresponds to this side length here that connects B to C. But this angle that corresponded to E was C, so it has to go first and then B. And then the last one is this side and that side. So side AE corresponds to side DC. And so that's how you would write your corresponding sides and angles. So if we have congruent triangles, that is when all of the corresponding sides and all of the corresponding angles are congruent. So you only have congruent triangles when you have corresponding sides and angles that are congruent. So looking at postulate 13, the side congruence postulate, SSS. So that's what the SSS for the lesson title stands for, side congruence postulate. If you have three sides of one triangle that are congruent to three sides of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. So if I gave you side lengths of 3, 4, and 5, there is only going to be one triangle that you can make. Now, it may look different than the one that your partner makes, but that's only because of the way it's turned, or flipped, or rotated. But if you rotate them or turn them or whatever, eventually you'll be able to put them right on top of each other. So if everybody had sticks that were in length of 3, 4, and 5, there's only one triangle that can be made with that. So that's what that theorem is basically saying. So triangle rigidity is talking about when you take your triangle and let's say it's a right triangle, and you rotate it, or you flip it, or whatever you do, no matter what you do to it, the side lengths are still going to be the same length. So it can only have one shape and size. And so that's what triangle rigidity is. If you have your sides that are a specific length, then you only have one triangle. Even if you rotate it, flip it, turn it, whatever you do, it's still going to be the same triangle. So we want to write a congruent statement for the two triangles. So start with the first triangle. Triangle ACT, we'll say. It is congruent to triangle over here. What side corresponds to A? Well, if you look, A has one arc mark, and the angle over here that has one arc mark is G. C is what came next, and it has 3 arc marks, and over here D has 3 arc marks. So it's going to correspond to C, and then T only had 2, and O has 2. So this is the congruent statement. ACT is congruent to GDO. You could put them as triangle CAT if you wanted. And if I did that, then the angle that corresponds with C is D. So it would have to go first. The angle that corresponds with A is G, and then the angle that corresponds with T is O. And so that would be how you could write it as well. You can write it in 6 different ways, but you have to make sure that the A and the G are always in the same location, the C and the D are in the same location, and the T and the O are in the same location. Okay? If not, then it's not a congruent statement. We're going to look at CPCTC. That's an abbreviation for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So on the last one, we had congruent triangles. I'm going to go back real quick. Since these triangles are congruent, that means that this angle here has to be congruent to this angle because our two triangles are congruent. So we're going to use CPCTC more often later on when we're writing proofs. But for now, you just want to get in the habit of being able to say the letters in the correct order, CPCTC, and know what it means. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we want to write the 6 congruent statements for the 2 congruent triangles. So on the last example, it said write the congruent statement. That means this triangle is congruent to that triangle. But when it says the 6 of them, that means you've got to do 3 for your angles and 3 for your sides. So angle R is congruent to which angle? Hopefully you're thinking angle L, because those both have one arc mark. Angle N is congruent to angle O, and angle U is congruent to angle P. So those are the 3 for the angles. Now go into the side. If I start with side RU, it is congruent to LT. If I do R or NR, it is congruent to side OL. And then if I do side NU, it is congruent to side OT. So that's your 6 congruent statements. If you have any of these letters switched over here, then these need to be switched. They should either look just like this or both sides should be switched. Otherwise, it's not going to be correct. Okay, we're going to look at another example. We have a kite where it says that the measure of angle JEK is equal, I left that off, it's equal to 100. We want to find the measure of EJK. So JEK is up here, and this is 100 degrees. And it wants us to find the measure of EJK here. So if you look here, I'm going to draw it a little bit bigger. If this is 100 up here, we know that these side lengths are congruent on the kite. That's part of the definition, that the consecutive sides are congruent. And so if we're looking for this angle here, it's going to be equal to that angle there. So the measure of angle EJK is the same thing as this, so we can really say 2 times it plus 100 equals 180. So 2 times the measure of angle EJK would have to equal 80 degrees. And if you divide by 2, the measure of angle EJK would equal 40 degrees. So that would be your answer for that one. So let's see if y'all can do these practice problems by yourself. So y'all pause the video and try them, and then I'll go over them for you after y'all unpause the video. So we're going to identify the corresponding angles and sides. So your angles should be angle Q corresponds to angle U. Angle P corresponds to angle S. And angle R corresponds to angle T. Make sure you're doing corresponding and not congruent to, because it said identify corresponding. And then side length QP corresponds to side length US. Side length PR corresponds to SP. And side length QR corresponds to UT. So that would be your corresponding angles and sides. Now it says write a congruent statement for the 2 triangles below. If it says A and not 6, then we're just going to do triangle is congruent to triangle. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle. So A is opposite the side length that has 3 tick marks. So D is going to be corresponding. B is opposite the one that has 2 tick marks. So E is corresponding. And then C is opposite the 1 tick mark, which is corresponding to F. So that would be your congruent statement for the 2 triangles. Okay, now we're going to look at this practice problem. So y'all try this one by yourself and then unpause the video and I'll go over it. So we want to write 6 congruent statements. So angle K is congruent to angle T. Angle J is congruent to angle S. And angle L is congruent to angle U. And then KJ is congruent to side TS. JL is congruent to SU. And KL is congruent to TU. So that would be your 6 congruent statements. Looking at one more practice problem. Y'all try this one by yourself. You're making a kite, as in example 4, with congruent triangles that make up the kite shape. One of the obtuse angles is 110. What is the measure of the other obtuse angle? What will be the total measure of the kite's other 2 angles? So y'all pause the video and then we'll go over it. So here's our kite. It says one of the obtuse angles is 110. So this angle is 110. The other obtuse angle is also going to equal 110 because this diagonal here cuts it in half. So the measure of the other obtuse angle is 110. And then the measure of the other two angles, we know that in a quadrilateral they have to add up to 360. So 110 plus 110 plus the other angles has to add up to 360. So that's 220 plus the other angles equals 360. So the other two angles have to equal 140. And we don't know which one equals what. We just know that this angle plus this angle equals 140. All right. So hopefully you got most of those correct. Now we're going to look at the challenge question today. So they tell us that that triangle is congruent to that one and that one is congruent to that one. Indicate all congruent angles and sides in all of the triangles. And what do we know about the two triangles? Are the smaller triangles congruent to the larger triangles? Explain. So y'all pause the video and try this one. So it says indicate all congruent angles and sides in all of your triangles. Since this big triangle is congruent to this one, is congruent to this one, this angle, and this angle are congruent. This angle, and this angle are congruent. And then this one, and this one are congruent. And then from the sides, this side, and this side are congruent. These sides are congruent. And then the bottom ones are congruent. For the little triangles, since these two angles are congruent, that means that this angle up here has to be congruent. And then they tell us that this side length is congruent to this side, which means that this one and this one are congruent, and this one and this one are congruent. So that would be indicating all of them. And so that means that the two little bitty triangles are congruent. And then if it asks about smaller triangles congruent to larger triangles, no, they're not going to be congruent because they're not the same size. Congruent triangles are going to be the same size. So if you've got one that's smaller or bigger than the other, there's no way for them to be congruent. So that would be your answer for your challenge question. Your homework tonight is 1 through 30, so make sure y'all do those so that we can go over any questions you have tomorrow.